Please welcome our speakers to the stage.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Martin Tisné. It's my pleasure to be chairing this session this morning. I've been really looking forward to this. We had a fantastic early conversation. We started the session already by Zoom, by phone, so it will be a real pleasure to have it in person. I am the Chief Executive Officer of AI Collaborative, which is a philanthropic organization, and I'm also the chairman of Current AI, which is a global partnership devoted to building this infrastructure for public interest AI. So I'm slightly conflicted in some ways in terms of my interests here, but I'll make sure that doesn't come up too much. We have a fantastic panel, which I'm really excited to introduce. Immediately to my left, we have Nayana Prakash, who is with Chatham House. Welcome. To Nayana's left, we have Bouverot, who is Special Envoy to the President for Artificial Intelligence in France, and a long-time collaborator, Martin Hullin, with Bertelsmann Stiftung, and of course, Michele, Jawando, the President of the Omidyar network. So a fantastic panel. We'll have about 30 minutes for conversation, and then we'll have a Q&A. The way that I'm hoping to do this is to give you a bit of a sense of the prologue. We need to get into the details of what it means to build public interest AI. Now, to go off-piste a little bit, I know that the panel is called AI for Good. I will say I sometimes worry about the nomenclature of AI for Good because sometimes it feels like a sideshow. Like there's the real AI, which is you make money, and then there's AI for good. My sense is what this is about is really, it's about the public interest. We want it to be meaningful. We want to avoid the mistakes that we've made in the past with some technologies, and we need to have a robust defense of the public interest and build an infrastructure around that. So in so doing, when we were preparing for the panel, we were thinking, and this was what we'll be doing, to structure it into 3 different sort of mini sessions. One where we'll talk about the economic models for public interest AI. What does this look like? The other one where we'll really get stuck into the question around sovereignty. Digital sovereignty, what does it mean in practice, and how can this help public interest AI? Does it hinder it? Question mark. And then we'll finish talking about international collaboration, and then we'll move to the question of Q&A and how you feel about it, and we'll try and have as much as possible a dynamic conversation. So this is what I wanted to say. So with no further ado, I wanted to ask the first question maybe to you, Anne. We were working together over the course of the last year in the run-up to the AI Action Summit in Paris in February. A lot of what we were talking about was this window of opportunity that we find ourselves in artificial intelligence. And partly the idea was that the window of opportunity comes from the fact that the business model for AI hasn't quite landed yet. And so there was this notion we were talking about that we'd missed that moment with social media in the early 2010s. The business model happened, and then the infrastructure got embedded. So how do you think we can seize this window now? Do you think the window still exists? And what does that make you think when it comes to the business model we need for public interest AI?
Yeah, thank you very much, and delighted to be here. We worked together with Martin and others, some on this panel, many of you in this room, to prepare and have the AI Action Summit in Paris. And we had a lot of discussions on that. We were very thoughtful, and in a deliberative way, we decided to have a narrative for the summit that was oriented towards inclusivity, sustainability, for the climate impact and public interest. So we really wanted to focus on this topic exactly for this reason that you're mentioning. I think for social media, we all saw this at the beginning as some innocuous, nice thing for people to discuss together. And now we're realizing all the risks and harms, in particular to children. And AI is, and so we're trying to catch up, and there's lots of discussions about what what we can do. But AI is more, even though the word has been around for a long time, the current state of AI with its social media, a little bit characteristics, is much more recent. And so now is the time when we absolutely need to seize the opportunity, learn from what we've learned from other instances, and do the right things as much as possible. Okay. So I completely agree with you on that.
So we've got the moment to seize the opportunity. So Michele, I want to ask you, what does that mean in practice? What is the business model for public interest AI? So we have proprietary models developed by the private sector, the subscription approaches and others. From a public interest perspective, what do you think? What sticks for this to be meaningful?
So first off, it is such an honor and privilege to be here and to see so many friends and work with so many colleagues on this issue. I think there are 4 constraints that as we think about public interest AI in the way that you develop that are top of mind for many of us. So there's a question around data, a question around compute, a question around opportunity for public voice and engagement, questions around equity, and then finally, questions around talent. And so we spend a lot of time at the Omidyar network really thinking about what are the access points for public interest, for NGOs, for academia, for researchers, for civil society to really engage. And it's one of the reasons why recently we supported, for the first time ever, as an international organization, we supported Governor Newsom's efforts in California around building something called Cal Compute. And what that really was an opportunity to open up what we currently see as a really concentrated market around compute and data, to open that up to researchers and academics and NGOs so that we don't fall into the same challenges where there's vendor lock-in and then all of the things that we dream about AI fixing, education, healthcare, climate, there's no capital deployment or resources to make those kind of dreams and opportunities come true. And so for the first time, we supported this legislation and endorsed that as a means to incentivize other states and other localities to really think about how do you build out the public options and the public resources to make that happen.
Thank you. Thanks, Michele. So you talked about compute, you talked about data. Martine, I want to bring you in on the data side. Specifically, you do a huge amount of work in Europe, amongst other countries, with Germany and with France. From a public interest perspective, how do you think about data? I think so current AI, we do a lot of work around data accessibility and use, and what we're hearing from a lot of stakeholders is the concern that we put data out, the we here might be different European governments, European citizens. We put data out in the open, and then the data there is used by private sector applications and not necessarily for the public interest. How does that sit with you? What's your take?
Yeah, that's one of the core questions, right? And before I start, also, thank you so much for being here, also amongst friends, but also lots of perspectives, hopefully to learn more also about how we are all approaching this topic together. So concerning the data dimension, I think I'll start with an observation and then quickly kind of lead to what we've been doing, trying to kind of demystify it. I think one observation is that we still fall into old patterns of seeing data very binary. And I'll tell you what I mean with that, because we always juxtapose data being either completely open or proprietary, and there's very little, I think, courage and creativity of the Goldilocks zone in between, of how do you responsibly unlock, this ambiguity of maybe sharing certain data with some players for a certain time, right? That's also going to the core of the theme of today's conference, the trust notion. If I share something with you, I'm building trust, right? But the trust might only go that far. And I think this has been something that, at least from the European point of view, we've been trying to regulate our way out of. I think there's the stark realization that, of course, regulation is important, but at the same time, also an infrastructure layer access to this type of data treasure that we are also sitting on, that should be used for the public interest, but at the same time also is key for potential competitiveness. And the debate, and I finish with that we have currently observed in Europe there as well, is that by falling in this trap, we use the analogy of data being the new oil, when in reality, if we put the S in front of it, it's the new soil on which public interest can kind of flourish. And if I kind of press the analogy a little bit further, I think the debate in Europe, and we hope this will actually also stick through in the coming months, is going more and more towards this notion of not really just being first to market and breaking things, but maybe positioning ourselves also as being first to be trusted, with exactly this nuance in between completely open and proprietary.
God, I'm going to quote you on that. Data is the new soil. That's brilliant.
Yes, I like that.
So I'm going to come to you, Nayana, and then I'm going to move to the sovereignty piece with a bridge question. But I'm curious, you've done a lot of work when it comes to the dual use of these technologies, usage for civilian purposes, for military purposes. This is obviously a very tense geopolitical time in Europe and in other regions. Help us think about that from a public interest perspective. How do you think about it?
Absolutely, and yeah, thank you so much. I think, when we talk about AI, we're often, and a lot of these times we're thinking about media, we're thinking about social media in these discussions, but of course AI has a military usage as well, and a lot of the companies that are providing military AI are also kind of commercial AI actors. So companies like OpenAI, like Meta, have recently been awarded contracts by the Pentagon, and there are also other kind of big tech companies that provide tech services to actors in conflict areas, whether that's Ukraine, whether that's Israel within the IDF. And I think the significance of this is that we don't really have guardrails on how big tech companies act in these spaces. And the role that they play in providing and creating military tech is also, by extension, a concern, because those same tech companies can and will provide and use that technology in providing and creating commercial tech, which is the tech that all of us use. And so if we don't have guardrails to restrict or to prevent the use of some of these tech companies entering conflict spaces and creating military tech, then what's going to happen when inevitably that tech filters down to society? We're already seeing some of that. We're seeing greater surveillance, we're seeing greater use of facial recognition technology. All of this has a really damaging impact on people and communities. A lot of this tech kind of began life and found its start in military settings. And of course, it just kind of clusters and intensifies the amount of funding and power that these specific big tech companies have, which I think is probably of concern to many people in this room. So I think the conversation about public AI, the conversation about how we can make better AI, should also extend to different kinds of AI. Who's providing it? Who's creating it?
Okay, brilliant. So who's providing it, creating it, and then ultimately, who's using it, right? And how does that work? So I'm going to bridge us to the conversation around sovereignty. It seems to me that a key question is, who are the users? If you're defending the private interest, you zero in on a particular type of user, whichever it may be. The user is someone who wants to rent out a bed in a particular town during a conference or whatever it is. From the public interest perspective, how do we have localized approaches that respond to the needs of the people living in those countries, those citizens? In some ways, like the word of the day in AI, one of them is the question of sovereignty. So before really prodding the relation between sovereignty and public interest, Anne, I want to turn back to you. I've heard you say this in the past, and I think you gave a really helpful definition of it. So help us first think through. There's digital sovereignty, there's data sovereignty, sometimes there's tech sovereignty, there's AI sovereignty, a lot of sovereignties. Help us think about it.
Yeah, there's lots of sovereignties, and I'm not sure I'll define them all. But first of all, I just saw a survey. Digital sovereignty is something that is meaningful to people in Europe and actually around the world, and recently more so. I think more than 80% of people in the UK, in Germany, and France, and Italy, in Japan think that digital sovereignty is important, and that has increased significantly. So it's even more important to define it a bit more precisely. I don't think we should think about sovereignty as we think about autocracy. This is not about having all the tech stack and products and services that we use all being homegrown in our little gardens. I think it's more about having choices, making sure that we can have meaningful choices if it's between two technological companies from the same country, well, it's better than no choice, but it's even better if we have a bit more choice amongst tech providers from different countries. And we also need to be able to think about sensitive areas where we need resilience. So for example, sensitive data or health or defense, those are areas where we need to be more careful. And in data, that was your question as well, for sensitive data, we need to think about what is sovereignty for that.
Sorry, can I push you a little bit? When you say
Sure.
in sensitive areas...
I'm trying not to be too long, that's why.
No, and I appreciate, and thank you all for this.
Yeah.
But when you say in sensitive areas we need resilience, tell us a little bit more what you mean by resilience in this case.
Well, we have lots of examples of tech companies from different nationalities deciding to cut the service. For example, in Ukraine, we have tech companies deciding or not, or threatening to cut services. There's a judge that recently had his email access revoked because he was engaging with practices that weren't okay for the government of that company. So for these services, there we're in sensitive areas and sensitive data, we need to have an ability to have technology that will not just disappear. There's one level which is price, which is why you need choice to be able to negotiate. There's one level which is you just need that to work and not be just blocked by someone from another country or government.
Thank you. Nayana, you wanted to jump in?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think the way you frame that is really important, because when you frame it in terms of choice, I mean, why wouldn't we want to have more choice? Like, why wouldn't we want the best kind of localized specific social media platforms, etc. I'm also thinking of sovereignty, though, in terms of, especially, I think, sitting in the UK and looking at this in, I guess, sovereignty washing, which isn't really a term, but I'm just using it right now, which is to think of, I'm thinking specifically of the US tech deals that have taken place over the last few weeks, and US companies coming here and making deals with the UK, and how that can be painted as a form of sovereignty. But obviously, it does create these dependencies with US tech companies. And you mentioned the really important example of Starlink and of Ukraine and of the danger, I think, of being too dependent on some of these companies. Obviously, in the extreme case that they might pull services, but also because these companies are completely fallible. I mean, we've seen in the last couple of days that companies like Amazon Web Services is down. We've all experienced that with some of these major companies. And so, but I also think that the word sovereignty is now being used a lot by governments, including this government, in situations that aren't really examples of sovereignty, but rather examples of tech companies from the US coming here to other countries, making deals and setting up shop abroad, basically.
I strongly agree. I'm going to come to you, Michele, on this. How do you think about it? I did think it was slightly ironic at some point hearing OpenAI talk about boosting country sovereignty by cutting deals with OpenAI. So what you're saying, Nayana, resonates very much. How does that sit with you, sort of based in the States? What are your thoughts on it?
I have a lot of strong opinions about this. And so here among friends, I actually think that there is an underlying question around concentration of power that we are often uncomfortable with saying. And I think it's really important for us to name those things so we can then think about how do we adjust. As the I am not going to represent the American government in any way. I worked and proud to work on Capitol Hill for many years. But one of the things that I will say is it is clear for most people to see that there are two countries that predominantly are dominating across up and down the AI stack. When it comes to data, when it comes to compute, when it comes to these major deals. And that shrinking concentration of power amongst a few companies is dangerous for all of us. And so we spend a lot of time at Omidyar Network really thinking about where do we have opportunities to shift the power imbalance that we currently see, to think about cultural context, to think about accessibility, to think about questions like affordability. If I ask this audience, who's an AI expert, I would like you to just raise your hand. Who's an AI expert in this room?
Good.
Okay, the next Trust Conference, I want everyone's hands up. Why? because each of you have individual information, context, power, information that you need to see as a valuable asset to shape the future of a conversation around AI.
Yeah.
And yet there are a few highly concentrated powers that will tell you they are the only experts, and they are the only people who can decide which way AI development should move. And so I think conversations about resilience and sovereignty are really an opportunity to push back against that idea that there are only a few AI experts, there are only a few who can shape the development of this technology. When I look at myself as a tech optimist and really believe that we each have an opportunity to use this powerful technology, but it can't be concentrated with just a few voices.
Thank you. Anne, you wanted to have a quick response?
Yeah, just a very quick one. I completely agree, and I think, because Martin will not say that, but Current AI, the initiative that he's chairing and that we launched at the summit, President Macron describes that as an initiative that stimulates the biodiversity of the AI ecosystem.
Without
I
question.
just wanted to say that.
Without question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Martin, I want to come to you. Okay, so this is really interesting. Michele, you talk about the issue of concentration of power, and you gave this very elegant, helpful definition centered around choice and resilience. So Martin, from a European perspective, what is it about? Is it about building alternative sources of power? Is it about boosting European companies? Is it about the Euro stack? Help us understand that, perhaps. Or, /and, is it about finding the commonality between, or the meeting point, the complementarity between what are public goods in artificial intelligence, or what should be public goods, one of the things we work with Current AI, and what should be of national competence? And how do the two meet together? And that might be something to come back to you, Nayana, as well, from the dual tech perspective. What do you think? Help us understand it.
Yes, let me unpack it, and I think I'll play off the last point that Michele made so well. I think at the end of the day, when we talk about sovereignty in the current debate, it's a reaction as well of this perception that we don't have agency at the moment. And that because of the power concentration and also this innovation paradigm we grew up with, knowing that there's this black box and we shouldn't worry about it, it's convenient, right? It kind of functions, that this actually takes away our ability for self-determination, including the democratic mechanisms that we have created ourselves to engage with agency in things that actually could affect our freedoms, our core values, etc. And this leads then over, I think, also to this question that you raised concerning then this mental model of the stack. And we've been conceptualizing with a huge consortium of very knowledgeable partners in Europe also this idea of a Euro stack. Not so much, as Anne so well also pointed out, to substitute all of the existing vested interest and infrastructures by alternatives, but to actually use this mental model for people to understand that there are layers here. When we talk about public AI or agency across the tech stack, the interdependencies, that come from the raw earth, the semiconductors, all the way through the data stack, all the way to the LLMs, and only then truly things could actually be then utilized with agency. But where am I getting to? I do think that at the end of the day, it's about this value chain. Where's the value generated? How do we actually benefit from it in a way that is also aligned with public interest, hence where are the incentives? And also to embrace this whole notion of this third path, that it doesn't need to be a choice between the preliminary kind of existing innovation paradigm of Silicon Valley, quick, break things, etc., or the state kind of governed Chinese approach that we have there, but really embracing this notion of there could be a third one, of not just Europeans, but in particular embracing the comments of saying, what are the building blocks we would need to actually put together, and then also how can we then make sure that we not only have more strategic options at our disposal, but where do we make ourselves with our approach to data, to public interest, indispensable in a globally competitive technological ecosystem, because truth and trust are very valuable aspects that are not being catered to by the other paradigms that I was referring to.
Now, Martin, let me push you a bit on this, and then I want to come back to the dual tech piece. We were talking about this earlier in the ante-room, the green room. There's the point about the third way. What worries me a little bit about the third path, the third way, is it sounds like we're going to catch up. And you made a point, and we were talking, it's a question about what game we're playing. And I was talking to a treasured colleague about this, and they were saying, look, we will never, from a European perspective, we will never beat big tech at their game. The question of like putting hundreds of billions towards compute, the question of, all of that. What is the game that Europe and other countries need to play? And then I'm going to go to the question, the last piece before taking questions on international collaboration. What is the game? The person I was talking to was saying, if they're playing, football, American football, we should be playing soccer. Different game, different rules. And what are the really local approaches? What do you think that looks like?
I think it's good that you're pressing, because that's exactly the trap that we are falling into, of saying, okay, there's something to win or outcompete somebody. And I think if we even consider going into this approach, we've already lost before we even started, because the circumstances are different, the financial ecosystem is a completely different one. And again, then, this narrative of like, oh, come, give up, just align, and take what is already there, is very hard to find counter-arguments for. But if you say, listen, this is not about being first to market, being first to be trusted. This is about data that is trustworthy for challenges that actually are global, that otherwise would be very difficult to develop. Then suddenly you're talking about USP, and you're talking about a competitive advantage, and you're not playing the same kind of challenge out that you probably would not be able to outcompete the incumbents that are there. And when I make it more concrete across the public AI notion, it's all about then, okay, how can we actually leverage smaller, more focused models, leverage the industrial strength, the data treasure, or the soil that we are sitting on, in order to then actually put solutions into the marketplace that are completely competitive, if not better, than what is there, because the heterogeneity of this data, if we use these building blocks across the globe, actually makes for better AI. And this is not an incentive that big tech has at the moment, because their bottom lines are looking great.
That's right.
They're raising their funding rounds, so they don't have an incentive to do that. So we actually have a window of a few years of going all in, but only if we don't fall into this narrative trap that we have to catch up, because that will not happen.
Yeah, completely agree. Nayana, you wanted to jump in?
I was just going to, I know that you were probably going to ask something about it, but I think that's
Please.
such a good point, and I think it's why metaphors like the AI race, etc., kind of fall down in this, because they not only imply that it's a catch-up game, but also that other countries have to follow the same path and do the same things that the US and China have done, which is not only not true, and I think is a very, very linear narrative of this, but also basically impossible, right? Like the amount of money that the US has sunk into this is not money that countries in the global south, for example, have. That doesn't mean that countries in the global south can't participate or like don't bring significant things to this table. It just means that it has to be done differently, and I think maybe what is important to work out, not only at this conference but beyond, is like how can countries do it differently?
Yeah, and I'd like to, quickly react on that. I completely agree that we need to be focused on what we want and how we develop it. However, I've gotten recently more worried about this development of AI led by the US and China for two reasons. One of them is that we think about these AI chatbots as the comparison is always, is this human intelligence, is it more intelligent than me, etc. I think a more helpful or different way to talk about them is their concentrated forms of culture. They're concentrated forms of culture in China because the government just wants that, and in the US because, and they're not always the same culture, but you can see ideology playing in these models. And on the other hand, all the small models that we want to use for our useful applications, which is absolutely what we need to do, they're actually distilled and derived from the larger models through open source, etc. So for these two reasons, I think we need to stay in the game of building powerful AI systems, not in terms of the race and trying to do the bigger is better and always the same, maybe, and not trying to catch up, but trying to maybe leapfrog, but being in that game of saying we want our models with the values that we agree on, and not just the choice between the American and Chinese models.
Yeah. I know Michele, and it's great. I'm going to mix and match a bit the questions the questions I have right now to keep it lively. There's a couple of questions, Michele, that are around this notion of that the panel implies that we have agency when it comes to artificial intelligence. There's a question there directed sort of at you and I. There's also a question in terms of do we assume that public interest AI models can never compete with big tech? So I'd love you to come in on what you wanted to come into and also on that question of agency.
No,
Thanks.
this is great. I think one of the things that is really apparent is that the conversation around the US is not really a conversation around what most people want in the United States. It is a private sector driven and led vision of how AI is used. And so the question is really, what do the American people actually want? And is that showing up in any real forum? I'm also the co-chair of something called Humanity AI, which is a $500 million commitment from 10 philanthropic organizations to identify, build, incentivize the support of civil society and NGOs of the public's version of what AI development will be. In all of the conversations that we typically have, the idea is put forward that this is the US and this is the US standard. And actually, what it really is are a few US-based companies and their interpretation of what AI should be. But from some of our research, when you ask parents, they have concerns around AI chatbots and the questions around social identity. When you talk to people in Appalachia and in the South, they're asking questions about education and access and sustainability. And yet those voices aren't anywhere in that conversation. And what we really see in many of the kind of multilateral spaces that we occupy is that the voice of the public of what do they want this moment to be, how AI should be used, and what are the type of products that should be put forth is missing. And so I often think it is important to make the distinction between what real people want and what I would argue what Americans are saying they want is very different from what companies are putting forth, what sometimes governments are putting forth, and there is the gap that must be filled. Now, philanthropy in no way can fill where the private sector is. I talked about $500 million, which for some people is a mistake on a balance sheet. But what we do recognize is the type of products, ideas, and areas of interest will diverge, and it speaks to creating new ecosystems that are more responsive to the needs of people, that really represent public voice. And it is one of the reasons why I think that this moment can't just be what governments or what private sector actors want, but really how do you develop the public voice, the talent pipelines who really have the sense of agency in this moment.
Thanks very much. Martin, I'm going to come to you. There's a question here, and then to flip to the international piece in a second. How do we fund it? How do we fund the question around public infrastructure, public interest AI? This sort of builds on what Michele was saying. What does it look like from your perspective?
In short, by embracing the in-between. I think it cannot either be just private sector or just public sector. It needs to be a blended finance approach by going exactly to the levers that Michele was describing of de-risking and also showcasing with a positive narrative the actual pathways where this can actually serve us, where technology serves society in areas where we really have the need for it. And this can be de-risked by philanthropic funding, of course, at the beginning. There are more and more also movements in the impact investor kind of ecosystem where folks also start seeing an actual use case where you can also run profit with, but also with intrinsic values. And then, of course, through public procurement, which is not always a very sexy term in itself, but especially in Europe is quite a powerful tool to set the incentives, align them to a certain extent, and then also get the private sector along to actually start building. And there are fascinating templates that could be used, some of which are active in Germany, called the Sprint Institution, which is all about, the leapfrogging that Anne has been mentioning, with, I think, a turnaround time of 14 days between the proposition and then also the funding being disclosed, and very fascinating challenges that will also be rolled out Europe-wide, in my understanding.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm mindful of time. I really want us to talk about the international piece, and I'll weave in the questions as well. It's so interesting. It's fascinating. A couple of years ago, a few colleagues and myself started an informal discussion around the geopolitics of AI. At a time where relatively few people were having those conversations. And then I'm seeing you nod, Anne. Part of my learnings from the summit is that geopolitics burst on the scene, and now I think we're all really, really aware of them. So in this context, what does international collaboration mean? What does it look like in artificial intelligence? We've talked about the public interest. We've talked about sovereignty, right? There are relatively few countries, arguably maybe only China and the US, that may or not be able to stand on their own on this terrain, question mark. How do we work together? What are the pieces we need to do where the unit of analysis is country or the region? What are the pieces where we need to work together? We do a lot of work with, for example, at current time with Morocco and others. What do you think, first?
Yeah, that's a great question. AI is very, very deeply geopolitical, and we could go on and on that, but I won't. I'll answer your question. What we tried to do at the summit was really to be as practical as we could, to try and do things in as broad a level as possible, and other things more specific. I'll explain that. We cannot just do it country by country on AI, because some of the players, most of the big players that we just mentioned in Silicon Valley, in Shanghai, they're global by nature. So we need to have a more global approach to things like regulation, but also to things like how do we develop a third way. No single country has enough money, enough resources to be able to be the third country that will develop an ecosystem as rich as the one in the US or as the one in China. But by pooling resources and interests together with aligned countries in different formats, we can do lots of things. At the summit, we launched Current AI, and that's a coalition of a few countries, a few philanthropies, and some private sector actors. That's one example. We also launched a coalition for sustainable AI on the climate front. That's something that we hoped all the countries attending would sign. Well, a few countries decided not to, so we decided to work with the ones that we could work with. And in an area like what should we do about developing very strong, powerful AI models, I think we should take the countries that are interested in doing that have great researchers and engineers, that maybe are abroad, by the way, but that could come back. And by teaming up, we can do great things. So I think we need to be both very practical, but also very mindful of who has aligned interest, and then have a specific project. I think that's one of the things we should continue to do.
Thank you. Nayana, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to sneak in an audience question.
Okay.
I think there's a link. There's a question around how do we expand the idea of public interest AI to countries that don't have a strong digital infrastructure and who are vulnerable to domination by external companies if they can't build, fund, or sustain their own, which seems to me linked to the points that you were making earlier.
Yeah, thank you so much. So quite a lot of my work focuses on India, which obviously is a country that does have strong digital infrastructure, but it's significant because India will be hosting the AI summit in just a few months' time. I think the role that India plays, and also the role that China plays in Global South kind of AI and tech collaboration is really significant, because even though these countries themselves can also oust kind of smaller parties from this conversation, that's absolutely true. I think, what I was actually going to say before is about something which I think is a significant conversation to do with AI and tech, which doesn't really get brought up that much, which is immigration, which I mentioned because Michele earlier talked about talent. And even the US can't do this by itself. Talent is a really significant part of this equation. We've seen that the US is kind of crippling itself in this way by attacking H-1B visas, by attacking universities and academic institutions. This is going to be a huge problem for the US in years to come, as really top scientists from these places, or potential academics, leave the country, perhaps to go back to their countries of origin. In this country, as it gets stricter and stricter on immigration, I fear that that's a really big problem as well. And I think there are opportunities here for countries like Europe to partner with smaller countries, aware perhaps that while I said Europe as a country, I meant a region, of course. Obviously being significant that these regions have funding, and these regions have a lot of a big talent pool themselves, but what smaller countries can bring is certainly talent, is certainly, the really strong diversity of voice and expression and training that we really need in AI and tech development. This sort of answers the audience question a little bit, but I think what I'm actually thinking about is that I am really worried about that aspect of things, about the ability of talent to flow from different to different countries, and the way that's being hobbled right now, I think will be really significant to these conversations for years to come.
Thank you. I'm going to close us off there. I think there's a huge amount, so I'll give my point of view on the international piece, if I may. I think there's a huge amount of landing zones for us to work together. On the India case, I think when it comes to linguistic diversity, which is one of the topics that we work on, you have 25 different countries 25 languages in India. There's a huge amount of knowledge and wealth as to how you can work from one language to another.
Yeah. There's actually well over 100 languages.
Well over 100. So how you can work from, when you're working in Tamil, when you're working in Hindi, and how then it works if you're working in Kikuyu, where you're working in Swahili. So that's an area which I think is fascinating. And there were audience questions around culture. When it comes to culture, we need to have public interest AI, which doesn't simply reflect an Anglo-Saxon perspective of the world or Spanish, or it needs to be a truly reflective of world cultures. And that is linked to the conversation about data. It's linked to so much of what we've been talking about. So at this point, we're over. It was my great pleasure to chair this panel. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for listening. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. Everyone.